This is an episode of Unconfined, the podcast of the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future in Baltimore, Maryland. Unconfined is a podcast about industrial food animal production and its emerging alternatives. You can find us online at clf.jhsph.edu. Mike Milley is our sound engineer and produces our theme music. Your hosts are me, Tom Philpott, and Christine Grillo. Paulette Wilson is our producer, and Natalie Wood-Wright is the executive producer. The opinions expressed here are not necessarily those of Johns Hopkins University or of the Center for a Livable Future. Welcome to the first episode of Unconfined for 2025. We are doing something a little bit different this time. We usually have one host and one guest. This time we have me as the host, Tom Philpott, and we have three guests in a panel talking about this new and different policy landscape that we're looking at going forward with another 4 years of Donald Trump as president, and this time starting off with a Congress that is controlled in both chambers by the Republicans, and what that means for food and farm policy going forward. And we've assembled three amazing guests to give us some insights about that. Let us and have them introduce themselves. Clara Calloway, why don't you go first?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. My name is Clara Calloway. I am a researcher and writer at the Open Markets Institute, which is a nonprofit advocacy and research group that focuses on antitrust policy and corporate power. I cover all things food and food systems concentration for open markets, and I also write the Food and Power newsletter.
Yeah, and if you want to sort of keep up with events and issues happening with antitrust and agriculture and corporate consolidation, you have got to subscribe to Food and Power and read Claire and her various freelance writing that she does as well. She's amazing. Let us now go to Mike Lavender.
Hey, thanks, Tom. My name is Mike Lavender, Policy Director at the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, based here in Washington, D.C. NSAC, for those who don't know, is a national grassroots alliance of organizations that advocate for federal policy reform to advance the sustainability of agriculture, food systems, natural resources, and rural communities. We have over 150 member organizations nationwide. You can learn more about NSAC at sustainableagriculture.net. Also on our website, you can sign up for weekly policy updates right there on the homepage to get the latest and greatest from what's happening on Capitol Hill and with the administration in terms of sustainable agriculture policy. And you can also find us on X at Sustainable Ag.
And once again, if you want to keep up with ag policy in DC, and it's going to be a crazy year for it going forward, you've got to subscribe to the NSAC newsletter and, just sort of follow Mike wherever you can in NSAC. Finally, let's move to Adam Scheingate.
Hi, Tom. I'm Adam Scheingate. I'm a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University. And I've been researching and writing about agricultural policy for a long time. And I also teach a class on the politics of food at Johns Hopkins.
And I've got to say about Adam that there are only a handful of political scientists in the American Academy who study foreign policy. And he's one of them, and he's one of the very, very sharpest. And I've learned a lot from him being his colleague here at Hopkins. Okay, with that, let's just jump into our conversation here. And I want to start by talking about the prospective USDA secretary. Donald Trump, pretty early on, nominated Brooke Rollins. As we speak right now, her confirmation hearing is not scheduled, but she's kind of a wild card pick. She doesn't have a lot of ag experience. She kind of comes from the, arch conservative policy world of Texas. and she kind of seamlessly, transformed herself into a MAGA policy person. And so, I wonder if we could talk a little bit and maybe start with you, Mike, about what we know about her and what we can expect from her, assuming that she gets confirmed.
Thanks, Tom. So President-elect Trump nominated Brooke Rollins to lead the Department of Agriculture, which I know folks who are listening may not know. The Department of Agriculture is one of the largest departments within the federal government, employing over 100,000, roughly 100,000, depending, folks nationwide. So you think of it as leading policy, but you're actually managing a huge number of people. And so looking at Brooke Rollins and her nomination, her background, her experience, there's not a lot of agriculture related experience. She's leaned into saying she grew up on a farm. And of course, those are experiences that can be brought to the role. But she also has experience leading the America First Policy Institute, which was a relatively small think tank organization that didn't focus a ton on agriculture, did focus on foreign investment in agricultural land. So when you start parsing through her record, looking for the substantive linkages to domestic agricultural policy, there's not a ton there to go on. And there's not a lot of record of experience in managing huge businesses, organizations with a lot of employees, which is a significant part of the USDA role. Which leads me to, there's a lot of questions that I think we need to hear from her on at her upcoming nomination hearing. You mentioned that it hasn't yet, as of recording, been scheduled. I'll close with this in saying that the qualifications that she has or lacks make the people who are deputy secretary, undersecretary, all the more important, and we need to scrutinize them just as much as we do the nominee.
Now, one thing I noticed under the first Trump administration was under Sonny Perdue led the ag department then, and there was a very it seemed like a concerted effort to get people from the giant company Dow to have sort of deputy positions in which has since become Corteva. And I'm kind of getting into Claire's realm. Do you expect that that USDA under Brooke Rollins will put a bunch of sort of chemical industry hacks into these key roles, or have you seen any indications in that direction?
Yeah, I do think it's too soon to say. I mean, it's it's quite unknown. I think it's you could take it as a slight silver lining, but also as a concern that this is a head of USDA that's not coming in with some of the, baggage of a more classic industry pick. A lot of the other candidates that were floated are folks that have those close ties to industries or trade associations that have really been, connected with large agribusiness interests for a long time. And, this candidate is not coming with much of that, but that doesn't mean that because of that lack of connection that, they won't nominate in, as Mike was pointing out too, those really important deputy positions, folks that do come with more of those industry ties. So that's definitely what I'm going to be looking for in terms of understanding how closely this USDA is going to be with the revolving door between agribusiness interests and USDA is those sub positions. But I think it's a little soon to know.
How are you thinking about Brooke Rollins?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Mike and Claire just said. We just don't know a whole lot about her, and she doesn't have a lot of experience that would give us a hint at how she might lead this enormous agency. But we obviously know that one of, if not the most important factor in these picks for Trump is loyalty. So the expectation is that she's somebody who will toe the line, and when there are issues that the Trump administration wants to pursue that touch on the USDA, that she'll follow through. Now, whether she can do that effectively is a separate question, and given the size of the bureaucracy, I have my doubts. But we can go back and look at the first Trump administration and see what kinds of things happened then, and maybe we'll get into that a little bit more as we discuss further. I do think I would expect, I guess, as Claire was pointing to, I would expect that a lot of the undersecretary positions would reflect the cronyism that I'm anticipating will be heightened during this administration. That people will be appointed who come from friends and allies of Trump, or whatever the highest bidder might be.
Mike?
Yeah, I think one more thing that I wanted to add is, when we reflect back on Secretary Tom Vilsack, who's preparing to leave the administration, has his roots in Iowa. And I think early on as Secretary of Agriculture under President Obama, that very much informed the way he approached the role. If we apply a similar metric, I mean, you could say the same for Sonny Perdue, right, who was Secretary of Ag under President Trump in the first term. If we applied the same rubric or line of thinking to Brooke Rollins, someone who is from or spent a lot of time in Texas, graduated from Texas A&M University, there's a really influential agriculture, school of thought within Texas A&M University that thinks a lot about federal policy and how it's structured. And so the challenge of being a Secretary of Agriculture is just like becoming a ranking member or chair of committee, is you're representing more than just yourself, more than just your state. And so I think the interesting thing, one of the many interesting things to watch, will be how does her perspective and role shift now that she's representing all of American farmers, right? Not just those in Texas, not just those in the Southeast, but those in Washington and in Vermont and in California and everywhere in between. And that's going to be the challenges. It's not just one type of farming, beginning farmers, underserved farmers, diversified farmers. We need to see a USDA that's serving all of those. And that's no easy challenge for anybody. But that's one of the key things to track with her in the early days.
Okay, let's shift a little bit. And here's a question that's mostly for Claire, but you other two, please jump in as well. Let's talk about the prospects for antitrust in agriculture under Trump. We did see some significant activity and rumblings under the Biden administration. And Claire, I wonder if you could talk about whether there are potential mergers on the horizon. I definitely want to hear your take on Lina Khan, who was the head of the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, who is a very, kind of historically focused on antitrust, holding that position. She became a lightning rod during the election. And yet there's some people in the MAGA world, I think, if I remember right, J.D. Vance is a fan of hers. He's got this sort of, sort of slightly different view than some people in MAGA world about antitrust. So I want to hear about Pam Bondi. I know that the Justice Department looks at a lot of mergers along with the FTC. What do we know about Trump's Attorney General pick, Pam Bondi? Basically, Claire, just sort of empty your notebook. Tell us what you're thinking about this situation going forward.
Absolutely. With J.D. Vance, I think maybe the term you were grasping for is conservative, which is some antitrust interested conservatives who support Lina Khan have called themselves. But yeah, I mean, sadly, it does look like Lina will not be continuing on at the FTC, even though we have the incoming vice president and some others, Republicans, who have supported her. President Trump has named her replacement, and it's Mark Mador, who is very much in the shape of a more aggressive antitrust enforcer who's approaching it from the right. he worked for Senator Mike Lee, who was a big part of the bipartisan antitrust bills that were crafted in 2020 through 2023. And he has also spoken a lot about the harms of concentrated economic power being, I guess in conservative terms, equal to their doubts of concentrated political power. But I think, and similarly, you were mentioning the DOJ, the Department of Justice is especially important for agricultural mergers. It's an interesting area where the Federal Trade Commission oversees like grocery mergers predominantly, where the Department of Justice oversees like the Cargill-Sanderson merger, like meatpacking mergers, big grain trading mergers, and on the flip side, though, consumer packaged good deal, like a big one that's going to be reviewed in the Trump administration, is Mars' acquisition of Kellanova. I believe that would fall under the Federal Trade Commission. So there's this interesting split where both are important. So at the Federal Trade Commission, I guess just to wrap up that before jumping to the DOJ, you're going to have a split of 2 Democrats and 3 Republicans. Again, one of them being Mark Mador, who may be open to some of the work that the Biden administration has been doing, but I also think it's important, especially with ag, not to overemphasize that alliance. I guess conservative antitrust reformers tend to be more disproportionately focused on big tech and not necessarily as vocal or interested in applying that same scrutiny to other industries, particularly agriculture.
Just to get into one case in particular, the rules governing the way the big meat packers deal with contractors was a big issue at the end of the Obama administration, and they finally sort of passed these rules. And then, as I recall, the Trump administration under, I guess this is under USDA, because USDA also has some say in antitrust for ag. The Trump administration quickly reversed them. Where are we with that? And where do you see these these people coming in? Are they going to sort of defend contract poultry growers, or do you think they'll throw them to the wolves?
Yeah, so that's USDA, the Packers and Stockyards Act. It's kind of like a miniature Federal Trade Commission Act, just governing the meat industry, and is in fact more expansive, I would say, than some of what the FTC does, but it's housed within USDA. Yes, so USDA has actually, the day that we're recording this, finalized its rule around how contract poultry farmers are paid. Many may have heard of the tournament system. That is the last rule that's going to be finalized. And then there were 2 others that were finalized earlier this year. So this is in some ways a similar situation that we had with the outgoing Obama administration, in some ways different. The plus side is that 2 of these rules were finalized many months ago. So one has to deal with contract transparency. Another one has to deal with retaliation. Those rules are pretty safe for the most part. This rule that was just finalized, in the lame duck period, is subject to repeal by the Congressional Review Act, which will be a big thing to watch in Congress. It is a risky thing to do. It's important, I think, to get the rule finalized, but it also means that if Congress is able to repeal it using the Congressional Review Act, USDA won't be able to issue a substantially similar rule ever in the future. So it sort of kills this area of reform. And in some ways, because of that concern, there was a fourth really important rule that USDA actually decided to withdraw. So it won't. It could be pursued potentially in the future. It definitely won't go into effect, but it will be protected from Congressional Review Act. And this is the big one that a lot of livestock producers wanted. It has to deal with defining fairness. Right now, farmers have to prove that if, a contractor or a meatpacking company treated them unfairly, that it harmed this idea of industry-wide competition, which is something that the courts have really read into the law, that USDA has made this really, really thorough case. It doesn't reflect Congress's intent when they passed the Packers and Stockyards Act. Point being, it creates this huge barrier for farmers that want to bring cases and actually unlock this really, frankly, good law. And so that was a big thing that livestock producers wanted that didn't get done in time. And so it can't be repealed by the incoming administration, but it's a change that didn't happen. So.
Yeah, and just real briefly, how serious is this sort of right-wing turn to caring about antitrust? And I think, obviously in 2017, it was very predictable that the Trump administration would reverse this. But now we're in this new world. Are you expecting them to use the Congressional Review Act to overturn that one rule you're just talking about? Or are we in a new world where maybe they won't?
I think that because Congress is so close, like even though you have a few Republicans who have, stood behind livestock reform legislation, I don't know if they're enough to overcome the, I would say, majority of Republicans that are still pretty skeptical of any kind of regulation for big ag. But I do think a lot of it will depend on the right-leaning trade associations, which we don't totally know if they're going to lean their support behind this specifically the rule regarding tournament payment. There's some glimmers of hope that some more center and right-leaning trade groups and lobby groups might actually say don't repeal this with the Congressional Review Act. That will really determine how challenging the fight is or not. But I don't think, point being, I don't think it's a foregone conclusion either way. I think it's going to be close. And I do think, like, big picture, compared to when Congress was so easily able to block these livestock reforms from being finalized under the Obama administration, the political will has really changed because of the pandemic. I would say the focus and heat on meatpacking consolidation is just much, much different than it was the first time that these reforms came around. So the consequences for Republicans of standing with meatpackers is materially different. And so I think that also, means this isn't a foregone conclusion.
Gotcha. Okay, let's talk about kind of the elephant in the room. We didn't get the Farm Bill expired in 2023. Am I right? At the end of the year in 2023, Congress is unable to write a Farm Bill in 2024. And so now we're in 2025. We've got this new situation in Congress, new leadership of the House and Senate Ag committees. What are the prospects for a farm bill in 2025? And there was a week or two ago, there was a provocative post by the great journalist Helena Bottomiller-Evich in her newsletter Food Fix, saying that the farm bill could be dead. The politics, and I know Adam has a lot to say about this, the politics could have shifted in a way that we're not going to see farm bills, that the old coalitions that brought them forth more or less every 5 years, after years of teetering, may have finally collapsed. Why Why don't we start with you, Adam? Can you talk about a little bit about what the prospects of a farm bill are for 2025?
Sure. So let me just start though by saying one of the things that's so interesting to me right now about agriculture and food policy is that in some ways it provides this fascinating window into the politics of Trump and Trump's rise and now Trump's second administration, which is that, kind of connecting to what Claire was saying, which was just so fascinating, is that, politics is about holding your coalition together. So on the one hand, obviously, large industry, agribusiness is a core part of the Republican coalition. But under Trump, farmers are also a core part of the coalition. And where you get these points of tension is where the uncertainty comes in, where we're just going to have to wait and see how these get managed. To give maybe a different example, which will come up again certainly under the second Trump administration, is that for Trump to pursue his trade policy against China resulted in large retaliatory tariffs against agricultural exports. But then through his control of the USDA, through the unilateral authority of the president, through the Secretary of Agriculture's control over the Commodity Credit Corporation, they could just dump subsidies into those sectors, those crop producers who are hurt, right? So that's an example where you can just, side payments hold the coalition together. That's a little bit that's a lot more difficult, I guess I would say, in the area of antitrust, because it's more zero sum. It's not possible for everybody to get what they want out of this. And again, I think we're going to see the same thing, going forward with the Farm Bill. I guess I would say, if I were a betting man, I would bet we are going to get a Farm Bill in 2025. It does touch on something I think Mike was talking about earlier, which is how will the commodity player coalition come together? Will they be able to find agreement across the different interests of sectors like cotton, rice, and so forth versus corn, wheat, and others? But at the end of the day, I think they will have to, because we're still operating under the permanent law from 1949, which in the absence of recurring extensions has this reversion point, which would, particularly in dairy and other crops, lead to immediate changes in pricing. And that's something that has always, if you go all the way back to the freedom to farm struggles of the 1990s, what ultimately was hanging over the head of Congress was they didn't repeal that act, and that then forces Congress to either renew or extend the Farm Bill. So I do think we're going to get a Farm Bill where, and I've written about this, where I think, yeah, go ahead.
Are you saying that we're going to get a new Farm Bill or an extension?
I mean, obviously both are possible, but I think there's still quite a lot of will in Congress to get a new Farm Bill, and especially given this is another kind of macro aspect of our politics right now, but we're going through the last 10 years have been the most closely balanced Congress in the history of this country, and some of the most frequent turnover in party control in the history of this country. So the Republicans know they probably only have 2 years that they're going to have control of both houses of Congress. And so if they want to use that time to get the Farm Bill that they want, they're going to try to push it through in the year. And of course, again, getting back to their constituents in agricultural states, there's a lot of pressure coming from large producers, the Farm Bureau, and the representatives of the big commodity organizations to get a Farm Bill. So there's going to be a lot of pressure on the ag committees to get that work done. So I do think that they're going to get a Farm Bill done, and then the sort of extension, the sort of 1 year extensions, that's sort of their fallback if they can't. But I think they're going to try really hard to do it, and like I said, I would put the odds that they're probably going to be successful. Now, where there is more question is, what does that mean for SNAP? Because that's the pressure point in the coalition for the Republicans that has caused the traditional Farm Bill coalition not to fall apart, but to wobble quite a bit. And ultimately, you've got different politics in the House and the Senate, which we can get into. But over the last 3 farm bill cycles, ultimately the Senate has put together a bill that can pass both houses of Congress, and I would expect that they would do that again.
Does the budget fight at the end of 2024, where they came up with a budget, and then Elon Musk and Donald Trump tried to kill it, and then they ended up with a budget similar to what they came up with originally? Does that tell us anything about how SNAP will go? Because I think some of the same people that were trying to bring that budget down are the people that want to kill SNAP, right? Do I have that right?
Yeah, but that's again that's fairly consistent over, if you go all the way back to the 2013 Farm Bill, what we've seen since then is Freedom Caucus Republicans, many of whom receive large subsidy payments to farmers in their districts, are willing to support SNAP amendments, which they know will not get a single Democratic vote, and actually will not pass a Senate vote where you need 60 votes for cloture and cutting off debate for a filibuster. Now, I expect that they'll do that again. I think it'll be again a challenge for both the House Ag Committee and Mike Johnson to get a bill through the House. But unless they try to wrap a farm bill into a big reconciliation package, which is obviously what they did in 1996, they're going to have to get some Democratic votes to get a farm bill through the Senate. And that's where either you get a Senate bill that reinstates some of those SNAP provisions, and then in the conference committee, you essentially get a bill that will pass the House with some mixture of Democrats and Republicans, and a significant number of farm state Republicans voting against the farm bill because of the SNAP provisions. So right now, I think that's what we're most likely to see again. Now, going back to our earlier discussion about the USDA, this is again where the unilateral authority of the president through the Secretary of Agriculture can accomplish some of those things without Congress. And so again, going back to the first Trump administration, there was a rule working its way through the Administrative Procedures Act process, which would have imposed pretty strict work requirements on SNAP, which has long been a goal for conservatives and Republicans. But for COVID and the emergency payments and increase in SNAP payments that occurred during COVID, that would have likely come through and been implemented. And I would expect them to just, dust off that rule and start the process again. And so we might see a farm bill that looks pretty incremental relative to what previous farm bills have looked like, including with respect to SNAP. And then maybe the Trump administration tries to achieve some of its more conservative goals with respect to nutrition programs through unilateral action and executive orders.
Interesting. Mike, your group NSAC really kind of bird dogs the conservation programs that are in the Farm Bill, the conservation title. And I know that there are knives out to cut conservation. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see conservation playing out in this situation that Adam is talking about, and also talk a little bit about the IRA climate smart funds that were allocated, and there's been a concerted effort since it happened to claw those back and throw them into subsidies. So yeah, just talk about the prospects for conservation funding going forward.
Yeah. Happy to, and I'd be remiss if I didn't just tag on to the Farm Bill conversation and say, I agree with Adam that there is still a will and a desire to get a Farm Bill done in this Congress and generally speaking, but it really comes down to the votes and the path that they can pursue to get that done. Over the past couple of years, and even prior to that, the margins, particularly in the House, governed by Republicans, have been so narrow that holding that coalition together for Republicans has been impossible, which means, in addition to the margin in the Senate, that you have to have a bipartisan bill. So I think the question on the Farm Bill over 2025 and 26, I think the desire is there. The question is, do they want to be bipartisan and craft a bill that's bipartisan and everything that comes along with that? That's the key question to look at with new leadership on the Democratic side in both the House and the Senate Agriculture Committees. But conservation plays right into that. And here's how. Congress passed a generational investment in the Inflation Reduction Act, including just over $18 billion of climate smart conservation funding for 4 key working lands programs at the Department of Agriculture. The deal at the end of 2024 somehow managed to include $20 billion in disaster assistance for agricultural producers, which is good. It included $10 billion on top of that for economic aid for commodity producers. But it failed, this deal at the end of 2024, to make permanent this generational investment in conservation agricultural practices. It shunned that opportunity to build resilience for farmers across the country for generations to come. It also excluded the opportunity to invest for the next year in what we tend to call stranded programs, the tiny but mighty Farm Bill programs that don't meet a budget threshold and need additional funding and an extension. So you have a package at the end of last year, as Adam pointed out, as we've discussed, that was really driven in large part by President-elect Trump at the 11th hour. In the contents of that package, it picked winners and losers, right? It didn't provide equitable investment. And so, to answer your question, Tom, bringing it forward to conservation for this year, there's a legitimate threat that Republicans could use the unspent conservation dollars from the Inflation Reduction Act to help pay for a reconciliation or tax bill. We've heard positive things from House Republican Chair G.T. Thompson from Pennsylvania saying, no, he doesn't want to do that. He wants to keep those funds where they are. But there's a lot to be figured out over the next few months, few weeks. So it's critically important that we defend those conservation dollars and make sure that when we do start drafting a new farm bill, whether it's passed this year, next year, or in 2027, that those dollars stay in conservation. And the reason that's important is because farmers want them. 70 to 75% of farmers are consistently turned away from the most popular conservation programs, including climate smart practices. So farmers are voting with their applications, they're voting with their feet. And Congress decided at the end of last year to keep them in that situation. And we need to right size that over the next couple of years.
And do you feel like the Democratic leadership and rank and file on the ag committees in Congress are going to go to the mattresses for that? Do you feel like they're really going to hold firm to try to preserve those?
I think there's a really good understanding amongst Democrats and Republicans of how popular conservation practices are with farmers. I was speaking with someone in West Texas the other day, and they said, all I hear from farmers is how much they, benefit from conservation practices. You hear the same in red states and blue states alike. So I think there's a good understanding amongst members of Congress that they're popular and that they should be defended. I think the question is, how much of those resources are going to stay in conservation programs versus be peeled off and re-diverted to Title I commodity programs or elsewhere to help make the math and the votes work on a farm bill this year or this Congress.
Right. I said that the farm bill was the elephant in the room, but I think there are actually 2 elephants in the room, and the other one might be just as big. So it's getting pretty crowded in here. The other one being this sort of rise of the quote unquote Make America Healthy Again movement as part of the Trump coalition, this sort of people concerned about additives and chemicals in their food. And the rise of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., nominated to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services. One of the things that Kennedy has done over the years, in our world here at CLF, he has been, over the years, an important figure in fighting, large animal operations and the way that they pollute communities through his work with the waterkeepers. And even in more recent years, he, in his campaign and after his campaign, he talked, lashed out at big ag, declared that he wanted a more diversified agriculture, wanted to get sort of commodities out of the school lunch program, as if he could do that by snapping his fingers. By commodities, I mean highly processed food. He would get that out of the school lunch program. How seriously should we take this opening in the conservative coalition for positive reform going forward? And I think this touches on the work that each one of you do. Why don't we start with Claire? How serious? He definitely, speaking of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has talked about the power of Big Ag and how it's got to be clamped down on. I think there was a Donald Trump tweet or Truth Social post after the election, kind of echoing that idea. How seriously are you taking this as a force in Washington?
Not too seriously, if I'm going to be altogether honest. I think it's really important to parse between popular rhetoric and then policy action. And as much as there are a lot of, shared enemies, I guess, between my policy interests and rhetoric from Robert Kennedy Jr., at the end of the day, he's still President Trump's Health and Human Services Secretary. So one, he's not really overseeing agricultural policy in a practical matter in terms of his nomination, but he's also sided with a fundamentally deregulatory president. That is what we do for sure know President Trump has done in the past and what he is interested in doing in the future. And I guess a lot of what RFK is talking about requires rules for big business. And it is really hard for me to see him winning out over the political power of big business, which just in the way that we see President Trump has been kind of building his cabinet and his relationships in this interim period before inauguration. CEOs, tech CEOs flying to Mar-a-Lago and kind of ingratiating themselves with the president. I think it's really hard for me to believe that we'll actually see this accountability, but I do think it speaks to the fact that it's something Trump supporters want and individuals and people want. And I think the big question is the RFK coalition is bipartisan. It's part Republicans, part Democrats. How big actually is this group of people that wants these things? And I think all political leaders should look at that and speak to that. I would much prefer to have leaders who don't come with really dangerous baggage for the public health in terms of pushing vaccine hesitancy and everything else that comes with RFK. But I do think especially the Democrats should look at this and they should fill this hole and actually do it would be, my hope for the future. And I would love to be proven wrong, but that's my feeling.
Not to plug my work, but I do have a column coming out of Mother Jones arguing just that the Democrats have left this gaping hole through which Robert F. Kennedy lurched through, and they should try to do something about that. Coming out in the next couple of weeks, I think. Adam, what do you? How are you looking at this this wild new force on the scene?
Yeah. So I want to say two things. One is just about RFK Jr. and then the broader dynamics with respect to his role. Assuming that he is confirmed, which obviously is still, we'll have to wait and see. But let's remember that the first Trump administration had the most turnover of any presidential administration in the post-war period. So by quite a margin. So lots of churn. So even if he is confirmed, again, I wouldn't be surprised if he's gone within a year, frankly, because that would both be consistent with other Trump appointees, but also given the real tensions that Claire was pointing to, I think those might be irreconcilable or irresolvable, which will lead to a rift that then he eventually leads to his departure. So I don't think he's going to be around for very long. That said, I do believe that this is portending a larger transition or transformation in terms of alignments between certain types of opinions with respect to science, public health, maybe even food, and partisanship. And in many ways, we're still grappling with the long-term consequences of a pandemic, which, among other things, significantly deteriorated the public trust, partly because of people like Trump and RFK Jr. and others who have, I think, in many cases, pandered and exploited opportunities to reduce people's faith in science, and that's something that will continue. That we'll be continuing to grapple with. But in a world where there's low trust, and in a world where politicians see opportunities to make hay by pandering to that low trust, we're going to see this dynamic going forward, and that's, I think, really troubling.
What about you, Mike?
I think we need to be careful not to mistake a couple of perceived areas of agreement at a high level frame with what NSAC prioritizes, which is, let's look at the details. Let's look at the policy. Let's look at the legislative text that can accomplish the things that are being discussed by anyone, including MAHA, which now, by the way, has a congressional caucus made up of different members of Congress. So there's a long way between the talking points and good policy and passing that through Congress. And I think we're focused on what's the policy, what's the detailed policy. We can talk at a high level, but how does that manifest into legislative text? And let's focus on that. So I think hearing a lot of things from Adam and Claire that resonate with us, but at the end of the day, it comes down to where's the momentum in Congress to include or not include certain things within Farm Bill or other legislative text.
I wonder if we can close by, I'm going to toss a wild card on you guys. I wonder if you could each talk about the sort of issue that you're going to be following most closely in this realm over the next year. And if you feel like it, and I feel like Adam has kind of already opened the door on this, if you feel like venturing a prediction, even if it's a hedge prediction, like I think there might be a farm bill this year. But and why don't we just go around starting with Claire? Just what are you going to be looking at as sort of a bellwether for your topic? And do you have a prediction for us?
Yeah, I think it will broadly be the future of these packers and stockyards rules that we mentioned earlier, both specifically the Congressional Review Act fight over this rule that was finalized in the lame duck period, but also more broadly, these rules in the way that they're drafted really need an aggressive USDA for a lot of them to work. And so that's what I'll be looking at, who's going to be enforcing these laws, and then specifically that congressional fight over repealing. I have to remain hopeful. So just for my manifesting, I guess I am going to hope that it does not get repealed by the Congressional
Okay.
Review Act.
Not a prediction, but a hope.
Yes.
Okay. How about you, Adam?
Yeah, I think that the issue that we didn't really touch on that I think is really interesting to watch is immigration, because of the important role that migrant workers play within our food system, and of course, this is the leading issue for Trump, and I sort of see this as kind of there's like a trilemma at work here. If you allow me to explain briefly, is that there's sort of three things going on. You can only have two of them. So So you can have like a competent policy that actually accomplishes the goals that the administration sets out for it. But that's cutting against what I would say are priorities for Trump personally, which is corruption and cruelty, which is how much can he sell off favors to his friends and how much can he pursue policies that hurt people. And you can't have three of those together. You can only have two of those things. And in something like the food system that relies so much on this labor, it's going to be really interesting to see how that trilemma is handled. Because on the one hand, you might want to have sort of very flashy deportations, but if that disrupts the food chain, that's going to have consequences for the administration. On the other hand, if you sort of sell off sort of, well, we're not going to enforce it here, we're going to enforce it there, and whoever comes to visit Mar-a-Lago gets a pass. Well, that's also going to be problematic. So I'm really interested to see how they're going to manage this issue. And again, as a political scientist, I guess if I have to make predictions, it's sort of the status quo generally wins for a variety of reasons. So I'm actually more likely to see there'll be little happening or little change. But unfortunately, that's not to say that there will be some significant numbers of people who are hurt in the process.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. And I'm remembering in the first Trump administration reporting on the just terror in farm worker communities of deportations and just the sort of, even just the threat, even if they, and I don't think they really made good on it very much in the first administration, but they did manage to cause a lot of pain and suffering just with the threat. And that's something that we're all gonna, and in terms of solidarity, have to pay attention to going forward. How about you, Mike?
I would fully agree that the threats, just based off the first Trump administration, the threats from a second Trump administration require all the focus and attention, both at USDA and government wide, that can be mustered. I think, however, in response to your question, I'm focusing on something a bit more congressional, which is the margins in Congress. House Republicans have a 2-vote margin as of today in the House of Representatives. Republicans in the Senate hold about a 3-vote margin. And what that means is that to get almost any legislation across the finish line, whether it's appropriations and funding the government, a farm bill, even a budget reconciliation package, which only requires a simple majority, the margin is razor thin. So what you need to watch is, how is the House Republican caucus going to manage that? Can they more effectively manage keeping their caucus together than they have the past couple of years? If yes, we're going to see a lot more legislation than we would otherwise expect. But to Adam's point, if it's the status quo and they cannot hold together like they haven't over the past couple of years, there's not going to be a lot happening. There's going to be a lot of words, but not a lot happening and getting across the finish line. So I'm really watching those margins in Congress and how they do or do not hold up over the course of the next 2 years.
Speaking of which, do people think Mike Johnson is going to survive the year as House Leader, Speaker of the House? Any guesses to be ventured?
That's a tough one. I think that's a tough one. I say it's a tough one because as Mike rightly points out, I mean the margin, the margin is so thin. The caucus is actually, the distance between sort of the Freedom Caucus and the rest of the caucus is wider. It only takes a few kind of mischief makers to make life difficult. On the other hand, the fact that he survived this vote maybe portends at least surviving this Congress. But we're also again in this world where if he crosses Trump or something like that and no longer has his backing, that could be his undoing. But again, I think he survived a really important test in the leadership vote, and that's going to help at least give him some momentum for the next.
Mike,
I would add that I think it would take something cataclysmic or significant for him to be ousted, which is certainly possible. But keep in mind that being ousted would mean throwing off the entire Republican Party's ability to swiftly accomplish things that they want to over the next couple of years. I think that will be a significant deterrent, at least in the early going, unless, of course, something significant that we can't anticipate happens. So I would expect him to stay in that role for the time being.
Any thoughts, Claire?
I kind of agree with both Adam and Mike, and I feel like a lot of it depends on if he crosses Trump. Because my understanding of how this last vote went, you had all these people, Freedom Caucus members, who at first were abstaining and not voting, and then they kind of made some calls, and I believe got Trump on the phone. He was like, yeah, okay, pass it through. So I feel like, to Adam's point earlier, there's a lot of turnover in a Trump administration. A lot of it kind of depends on where you stand with the big guy on top, so to speak, and he's pretty unpredictable. But agreed, though, with Mike's point, the window for getting through an aggressive agenda is really short, and that could be enough to hold things together.
All right, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much, all three of you, for these insights. I've learned a lot, and we look forward to having you all on Unconfined at some point to talk about these issues at more length. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you.